At my father's funeral, my brother-in-law claimed his company and $500 million, then laughed and handed me an old truck. What he didn't know, my dad had already decided who would really win. The rain hadn't stopped all day. It felt fitting. While we were lowering my father into the ground, Richard stood under a massive black umbrella. Calm and smug like this was a business deal, not a funeral. The moment the last guest walked away, he cleared his throat and smiled. From today on, he said loudly, the company is mine. $500 million. Signed, sealed, celebrated. Then he tossed something at me. Keys, old, scratched, heavy with disrespect. All you get, Richard added, adjusting his tailored suit, is your father's old truck. Stick to your flowers, Morgan. Leave real business to the men. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I closed my fingers around the cold metal, felt it dig into my skin, and turned away from the empire I helped keep alive. The truck door groaned as I climbed in. Inside, the air smelled like peppermint gum and old tobacco. My dad, the kind of scent that hits before the grief does. For one brief second, my chest tightened. I wanted to rest my head on the steering wheel and let everything fall apart. Then I looked in the mirror. Richard was still standing there, watching, smiling. That smile burned the tears away instantly. Grief could wait. Anger was more useful. I turned the key. The engine coughed, hesitated, then roared to life, loud and stubborn, just like my father. I shifted into gear and pulled away, leaving the mansion behind without a single glance. Stick to your flowers, he'd said, as if growing something were weakness. For 3 years, while cancer slowly stole my father piece by piece, I was the one changing for bags. I was the one timing medication, holding his hand when pain stole his memory. Where was Richard? On golf courses, at networking dinners, running the company into quiet decline while waiting for my father to die. He thought illness meant blindness. He was wrong. My father saw everything: who showed up, who disappeared, and who only cared about signatures. As the iron gates disappeared in the distance, the truck's screen flickered. The navigation system turned on by itself. A destination appeared already saved. My dad's handwriting was in the label, and that's when I realized the truck wasn't an insult. It was an invitation. She had stood right beside Richard while he tore me down. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't even looked at me. Years ago, that silence would have shattered me. I would have called it betrayal, cruelty, but as the truck followed the winding coastal road, something colder settled in. Samantha wasn't heartless. She was conditioned. Richard hadn't just taken control of the company, he had taken over her thinking. Over 10 years, he'd reframed control as leadership. He'd disguised arrogance as ambition. Slowly, deliberately, he'd trained her to mistake fear for loyalty. In her world, questioning him wasn't courage, it was treason. She didn't defend me because defending anyone meant challenging the system she survived in. She was living inside a psychological cage. No bars, no locks, just consequences she'd learned never to test. I wasn't just driving away from my sister. I was leaving her behind with the storm. I was nearing the highway when the dashboard flickered. The radio hissed with static, snapping the silence, and the digital clock blinked 12 o'clock. Then the center screen lit up. This wasn't the truck's original system. A newer GPS unit had been awkwardly installed, barely hidden in the console. It chimed one sharp, intentional. A single destination appeared. No address, no road name, just 2 words, glowing green. Point Z. My father's voice surfaced in my memory, steady and unmistakable. Drive carefully, Mo, you know the way. A chill crept up my spine, nothing to do with the air conditioning. I didn't turn toward my apartment. I tightened my grip on the wheel and headed for the coast. The funeral wasn't the ending, it was the opening move. The GPS guided me off the pavement onto a narrow gravel path, carved like a scar along the cliff's edge. Below, the ocean thrashed against the rocks, stark, restless, relentless. Point Z wasn't a bank, it wasn't a law office. It was the old lighthouse warehouse, the place where my father had parked his very first truck 40 years ago. It sat alone on a forgotten stretch of headland, paint peeling, metal rusting. The Titan Logistics logo, barely visible, faded into a ghost of itself. To the world, it was abandoned. To Richard, probably just another liability to erase. But as I pulled up to the rusted bay doors, something clicked. This was the one place Richard never touched. Too grimy, too unglamorous, too far from the boardroom. I shut off the engine. The silence pressed in, broken only by wind slipping through cracks in the siding. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out. The key Richard had tossed at me wasn't just for the ignition. There was a second key on the ring, smaller, older. It slid smoothly into the lock. The padlock snapped open with a solid, final click. I pulled the heavy steel door wide, bracing myself for dust, rust, and decay. Instead, I smelled Earl Grey tea. In the center of the vast hollow warehouse sat a folding table, and at it, my mother. One industrial work lamp cast long, deliberate shadows across the concrete walls. Susan, the woman who had trembled through the entire funeral, clutching her handkerchief and leaning on Richard like she might collapse now, sat upright, composed, reviewing a file. She looked up, her eyes were clear, her hands steady. "Close the door, Morgan," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was the same voice that had once kept this company afloat when it was nothing more than 2 trucks and a handwritten ledger. I stood frozen. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I whispered. "Richard thinks you're back at the estate." Sedated, she closed the folder and nodded toward a heavy, fireproof safe resting beside the table. "Richard believes exactly what we want him to believe," she said calmly. "That I'm a grieving widow who'll sign whatever document he slides across the table. That you're a broken gardener who'll drive this truck until it disappears." She met my eyes. "He's wrong on both counts." I stepped closer, my gaze locked on the safe. "Why?" I asked quietly. "Why did Dad let this happen? Why did he let Richard take everything? Why did he leave me with nothing but that truck?" My mother rose and crossed the space between us. She cupped my cheek, her touch firm. "He didn't leave you nothing, Morgan," she said. "He left you the weapon." Then she told me the truth that reorganized every memory of the last 3 years. My father hadn't been oblivious to Richard's greed. He had been studying it. He knew that firing Richard outright would have triggered destruction. Richard would have leveraged debt, poisoned partnerships, and taken Samantha down with him just to prove a point. He had made himself indispensable. The company's load-bearing wall, remove him by force, and the whole structure would collapse. So my father waited. He let Richard believe the illness had dulled his instincts. Let him think the theft went unnoticed. Let him feel untouchable. Arrogance was Richard's only weakness, and Dad knew it. Richard would never fear me because he never respected me. That was the plan, and as my mother placed her hand on the safe, I understood something terrifying and brilliant at the same time. The game hadn't started at the funeral. It had been in motion for years. Richard never bothered to check the truck. To him, it was scrap metal on wheels, beneath his notice, exactly as my father intended. Dad had built a Trojan horse out of rust and patience and waited until he was gone to let it roll forward. My mother turned the dial on the safe. It clicked open. "It was never an insult, Morgan," she said, pulling the heavy door wide. "It was a transfer." I barely slept that night. Inside the safe were only 2 items: a leather-bound notebook, worn soft with use, and a hard drive labeled in my father's handwriting, "Shadow Books." I opened the notebook first. It wasn't a journal. It was evidence. For 5 years, my father had documented everything, every unexplained withdrawal, every altered invoice, every shell company quietly routed through offshore accounts, dates, amounts, patterns. Richard wasn't just careless. He was draining the company to feed a gambling problem that had spiraled completely out of control. Millions lost at high-stakes tables overseas, every loss patched over with company money borrowed from employee pensions, stacked against company assets with brutal interest rates. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the forgery. I found a folder of loan documents, all signed by Samantha. My sister's signature was flawless. Too flawless. A copied digital stamp, pasted again and again. Richard had set her up. If the company collapsed, creditors wouldn't just come for the business. They'd come for her. Fraud charges, prison, a crime she didn't even know she was committing. In that moment, everything shifted. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about the humiliation at the funeral. It wasn't even about the truck. This was a rescue. Richard hadn't just stolen money. He'd turned my sister into his shield. When I finally looked up, dawn was breaking over the ocean, the sky bruised with purple and red. My mother slept in a chair, wrapped in a blanket, peaceful for the first time in years, free from the secret she'd carried alone. I walked to the window. Outside, the old truck sat in the tall grass, catching the first light, solid, unremarkable, dangerous in its simplicity. Richard saw a gardener when he looked at me, someone small, harmless, easy to dismiss. What he never understood was that gardeners know exactly how to cut out a disease before it kills the entire tree, and we're not afraid to get our hands dirty. I closed the notebook. The fear that had lived in my chest since the funeral disappeared, replaced by something sharper, clearer. Richard believed power came from holding the keys to the castle. He didn't realize I had the blueprints to the foundation, and I knew exactly where the weak points were. I didn't attack him. Not yet. I went back to work. I pulled on my mud-stained boots and canvas jacket. I designed Zen gardens. I trimmed roses for clients, Richard openly mocked. To the world, I was the sister who had accepted her place. To Richard, I was invisible. That invisibility was my greatest advantage. While he was shopping for a 70-foot yacht he couldn't afford and firing senior managers who questioned his decisions, I was meeting them quietly. I used the operational cash my father had set aside his war chest to hire the best forensic accountant in the state. Then I started making calls. Former board members Richard had pushed out, executives he'd alienated, partners he'd dismissed. We met in places he would never go: roadside diners, public parks, the back of my nursery. I drove the rusted truck to every meeting. It became a signal. When I pulled up, they didn't see failure. They saw patience. They saw a plan. And they listened. They didn't see a failed gardener pulling up in an old truck. They saw Robert's daughter driving Robert's truck. They saw continuity. They saw respect. I showed them the shadow books, not everything. Just enough to demonstrate that their dividends weren't shrinking by accident. Just enough to trace the money trail disappearing into a private gaming circle overseas. Skepticism didn't last long. It curdled into fury. One by one, they signed their proxy votes over to me. While I was quietly assembling the numbers, Richard was falling apart. Accounts he tried to access suddenly locked up, frozen by injunctions my attorney had filed without fanfare. Cash flow tightened. Credit lines vanished. Control slipped through his fingers, and he had no idea why. Then the phone call came. Late, sloppy, fueled by top-shelf scotch. "I need you to sign some papers, Morgan," he said, skipping courtesy altogether. "Just restructuring documents for the estate. I need to liquidate a few older assets to streamline operations." I kept my voice small, harmless. "I don't really understand this legal stuff, Richard," I said gently. "You know I'm not great with business. Maybe we should wait for the quarterly board meeting. I can bring them then." "Don't be stupid," he snapped. "Just sign them. I'll give you $5,000. Buy yourself some new tools." "I'll see you at the meeting," I replied, and I hung up. I looked at the calendar on my wall. 3 days. I had the votes. I had the documentation. And most importantly, I had surprise. Richard thought he was walking into a celebration. He had no idea he was walking into accountability. The quarterly board meeting convened in the Glassworld conference room, high above the city and Titan Logistics headquarters. Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table, worn down and visibly strained. His eyes were bloodshot. His tie hung loose. The confidence was gone, replaced by sharp, frantic energy. He didn't look like a leader. He looked like someone running out of time. "Let's get this over with," he barked, ignoring the agenda entirely. "I'm moving to dissolve the current board structure and consolidate executive authority. We need speed, not committees." No one spoke. The remaining board members, the few he hadn't already pushed out, shifted uncomfortably. They knew the company was bleeding, but fear kept them silent. Then the double doors opened. I walked in, no canvas jacket, no dirt under my nails. I was wearing a tailored navy suit, quiet, precise, unmistakable. Behind me followed 2 men, Arthur Sterling, forensic accountant, and Detective Miller, Financial Crimes Division. Richard looked up, confused. Then he laughed, thin, brittle, forced. "What's this?" he scoffed. "Bring your daughter to workday. Go back to your flowers, Morgan. The adults are talking." I didn't answer. I walked calmly to the front of the room, and that's when the room finally understood. This meeting wasn't about restructuring. It was about exposure. I plugged my laptop into the presentation system. The screen behind Richard lit up. Not a chart, not a forecast. A loan application for $5 million, signed by Samantha. Beside it, I projected the digital metadata, timestamps, file history, clear proof that the signature had been lifted from a scanned birthday card and pasted onto multiple documents. "I'm not here to talk about flowers, Richard," I said calmly, my voice carrying across the room. "I'm here to talk about the $40 million you've siphoned out of this company." His face drained of color, then flushed red. He shot to his feet so fast his chair toppled backward. "This is fabricated. That's restricted data. This meeting is over." "Sit down," I said. It wasn't a suggestion. "I own the debt, Richard. I acquired the outstanding loans this morning. I control 60% of the voting shares. And I have the shadow books." I clicked the remote. The screen filled with numbers, withdrawals, transfers, shell entities, losses tied to private gambling circles. The room inhaled as one. Richard stared at the screen, then at me, then toward the exit. And then he collapsed. Not in anger, in exposure. The carefully constructed image, the brilliant executive, the untouchable strategist. He didn't lash out. He unraveled. "This isn't my fault. he shouted, voice cracking. The market shifted. I was trying to protect us. Your father planned this, he wanted me to fail. Then Samantha walked in. Richard turned on her instantly. And you never supported me. You only cared about the money. I did all of this for you. It was the final break. Blame scattered in every direction as his authority shrank before our eyes until all that remained was a desperate man in an expensive suit. He looked at me, pleading, Morgan, we're family, please. I met his gaze, steady and distant. We're not family, Richard, I said quietly. You were just a bad investment. I nodded once. Detective Miller stepped forward. Richard was escorted out, still shouting about lawyers and conspiracies, until the elevator doors slid closed and cut him off mid. Silence settled over the room. Samantha stood frozen near the doorway, staring at the screen where her forged signature glowed in sharp detail. She studied it for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Something finally broke free. Not anger, not hysteria. Grief, she cried. Softly, the sound of someone mourning lost years and a truth she had never been allowed to see. I crossed the room and held her. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Mo. It's over, I said gently. You're safe now. The weeks that followed were difficult but necessary. The company went through a full reset. I stepped into the CEO role temporarily, just long enough to stabilize operations. Arthur Sterling became CFO. Alanham, my father's former right hand, returned as interim president, and I realized something important. I didn't want the corner office. I didn't want to live in glass towers. My place was shaping values, protecting people, making sure the roots were strong, not just the surface impressive. Samantha filed for divorce and began therapy. Healing wasn't easy. The financial cleanup was complex, but for the first time in years, I saw her smile, an unguarded one, not the careful expression she wore for survival. 6 months later, I walked out into the parking lot of the nursery where I still worked part-time. The truck was waiting. I hadn't sold it. I restored it. The rust was gone. The engine rebuilt. The body repainted a deep forest green solid. Timeless. Proud. No longer a symbol of neglect. A symbol of endurance. I climbed inside. The peppermint scent remained, but the stale air was gone, replaced with fresh leather and sage. I opened the glove box and found a cassette I'd discovered during the restoration. Road Trip Mix 98. I slid it into the deck. Static. Then my father's voice recorded over the start of a song. Drive carefully, Mo, you know the way. I smiled. I put the truck in gear and headed toward the coast as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and violet. I wasn't just a gardener anymore. I was a steward of a legacy, and the harvest had finally come in. Sometimes, protecting the people you love means playing the long game. Sometimes, you let the weeds grow just long enough to pull them out by the roots.